My name is Christian Dean, and today I'm going to be discussing the components of a computer and their individual functions. When you're dealing with a computer, you pretty much have four basic pieces of hardware that are essential to a computer running. You have the CPU, the RAM, the hard drive, and the motherboard. And I'm just going to right now, I'm going to go into detail about the CPU, or the central processing unit. The CPU is what you would call the brain of the computer. Its main job is to send out functions to the rest of the hardware, such as, if you're, surfing the internet or typing on the computer or playing a video game. All that basically depends on your CPU sending out functions to each individual piece of hardware. Now, the next part of the computer would be the RAM, which in my opinion is the most complex part of the computer because it does so many different individual things. First off, the RAM is basically a smaller version of your hard drive. What it does is, when you open a program, it basically stores all of that program's data onto the RAM. It's different than a regular hard drive because when you save something on a computer, that piece of data is basically just stored on your computer for good, and the only way it's going to get off of your computer is if you delete it yourself or something unfortunate happens. But on the other hand, RAM, its primary job is when you open a program, or when you surf the internet, or when you listen to music, or any of those things, that program stores data in the RAM. And what that does is, every program that you use takes up space. So with that when you open that program, it basically sends data to the RAM for temporary storage. So when you close out that program, the data is essentially deleted from the RAM. So when they say, you can't have really too much RAM, the more RAM you have, the more simultaneous programs you can actually run on your operating system, which is a good thing. Next, we have the hard drive. Unlike RAM, when you store something on your computer on your hard drive, it's there for good. So when you're typing up like a Word, like a Word document, or you are downloading movies, or you're downloading music, once you choose to save that file, it's basically stored on your hard drive, and it's there, whenever you turn your computer off, and it's pretty much not going to be, it's not going to be gone until you delete it yourself. So that's pretty much the main difference between RAM and a hard drive. RAM, it's temporary, or I should say it's constantly refreshed, and a hard drive, it's not temporary, it's a permanent solution to storing your data on your computer. And lastly, we have the motherboard. Now, the motherboard, it only does one thing, but it's probably the most important piece of your computer. What it does is, if I had to call the CPU the brain, I would call the motherboard the heart. Why I say that is, every piece of hardware on your computer basically connects to the motherboard. So that way, it's basically a receiver, and the CPU is, I don't know how should I put it, the CPU sends out signals and the motherboard receives them. So it basically just receives all kinds of signals and directs those signals to each appropriate piece of hardware on the computer. So it's basically like the heart. It's why I say it's the most important piece on the motherboard is because, if I wanted to give another analogy, the human brain is pretty much useless without its spinal cord, and the same thing goes with a computer. If you don't have your motherboard, your CPU is pretty much useless. So that's pretty much a rundown of all four components of a computer. And with that, I think you should be able to apply that information that I gave you and be able to use it in practical use. Thank you, and that was my speech.